The room had about 30 people in it, and none of them wanted to be the one who said what Corporal Daniel Kovacs had just said. He was 22 years old, a corporal, the lowest-ranking man in a space occupied by colonels and majors and lieutenant colonels, who had been looking at the same map for 15 minutes, while General George S. Patton traced a route with his finger and described what the Third Army was going to do with it. And Kovacs, standing near the back wall in a capacity that nobody would later be entirely clear on, attached to the G2 section, working with the map team, present because somebody needed to be, had done the calculation twice and then raised his hand. He said, "Sir, I think the map is wrong." The room went quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet when something has been said that cannot be unsaid. Nobody moved. The colonels looked at the table. The majors looked at the floor. The adjutant standing nearest to Patton appeared to reconsider the entire architecture of his service record in the space of about 2 seconds. And General George S. Patton, commanding general of the Third Army, looked up from the map and across the room at the corporal in the back and did not say anything. What happened in the next 60 seconds would determine whether Daniel Kovacs had just saved his career or ended it. And the answer, when it arrived, was not what anyone in that room was prepared for. If you want more untold stories from World War II, hit that subscribe button. Let me back up a second, because to understand what it cost Kovacs to say what he said, you need to understand what a Third Army staff briefing was, what it looked like, who was in it, and what the unwritten rules of that space were. A Patton briefing was not a seminar. It was not a discussion. It was information flowing up and orders flowing down, in a room where rank was the most visible thing about everyone present, and where the distance between a corporal and a commanding general was not a matter of feet, but a matter of the entire organizational chart of the United States Army. The officers who attended these briefings were experienced men. They had earned their ranks through campaigns and the accumulated weight of professional judgment. Some of them had opinions about the maps on those boards. Some of them had looked at the same overlay Patton was pointing at and had the same reservation that Kovacs had. And they had kept those opinions to themselves, because this was the Third Army and this was Patton, and a general who wore ivory-handled pistols and drove through artillery range and expected the road to move when he was on it, did not routinely invite correction from colonels, let alone from the lowest rank in the room. That was the room Daniel Kovacs raised his hand in. Now, here's the thing. The Third Army's operational success in 1944 was built on a specific foundation that was easy to overlook in the accounts of fast marches and dramatic crossings, and the sheer speed of the advance across France. What built that speed was not recklessness. It was the accuracy of the planning underneath it. A wrong road could delay a division by hours. A misidentified bridge rating could strand armor on the wrong side of a river. A map error in a staff briefing was not an academic problem. It was a potential catastrophe measured in fuel and time, and at the far end of the arithmetic, men who were depending on the information being right. And the overlay that Patton was pointing at that morning had something wrong with it. The junction he was tracing, placing on a road running through the northern edge of a particular French town, was not where the overlay showed it. The town's road network had been significantly altered in a reconstruction effort in the mid-1930s following flood damage, and the junction that appeared on the overlay was based on cartographic information that predated those changes by nearly a decade. The actual junction was roughly 1.5 kilometers southwest of where the overlay placed it. In map terms, a small distance. In the terms of a mechanized column moving at speed through unfamiliar terrain, it was the difference between arriving on time and arriving 3 hours late, between a coordinated advance and vehicles stacking up on a road that didn't connect to the route they had been briefed on. Kovacs knew this because before the war he had spent 2 years doing field survey work, and the map archives he had worked through included the exact administrative records documenting the 1930s reconstruction. It was not common knowledge. It was the kind of knowledge that arrives from standing in actual terrain with a transit and a notebook, and checking what the map says against what the ground says, until the difference between those two statements becomes the only thing you look for when you look at a map. He had recognized the error immediately. He had done the calculation about whether to speak. He had waited while a colonel, who was certainly looking at the same section of map, said nothing. He had waited while a major with operational responsibility for the route under discussion said nothing. And then he had raised his hand. Picture the scene. 30 men in a room, a map on a board, a general's finger on it, one corporal's hand going up. Here's what doesn't make it into the history books. The silence that followed Kovacs speaking lasted long enough for every person in that room to make a private assessment of what they were watching and what it was going to produce. Some of the men around that table had the same question Kovacs had just voiced. They had felt the same unease and calculated the same cost of speaking and arrived at a different answer than Kovacs had. The colonels who said nothing were not incompetent men. They were men who understood the rules of the room they were in, and who had decided, in the space of a breath, that the rules outweighed the error on the map. That calculation, the one that produces silence when accuracy requires speaking, is the thing that Patton understood better than almost any other commander in the theater. He had seen it operate at cost. He knew what a staff of yes-men produced because he had watched other commands produce it. An army in which the man with the most rank is always right is an army that will eventually drive a column down a road that doesn't exist. And the cost of that error is not borne by the men who stayed quiet in the briefing. It is borne by the men in the vehicles. Stay with me, because what happened next in that room is the part nobody was expecting. The accounts that survive are consistent in shape. Patton looked at Kovacs for a long moment. Not the way a general looks at an interruption, not the way a man looks at something that has irritated him. He looked at Kovacs the way he looked at terrain, reading it, taking the measure of what he was seeing. And then he said, with the brevity that characterized everything he said when he wasn't performing, "Show me." Kovacs came forward, from the back of the room to the map table, past the colonels and majors, to stand beside Patton at the overlay. He indicated the junction. He explained the discrepancy, the 1930s reconstruction, the displacement, the specific distance between where the overlay placed the junction and where it actually was. He did not speak for long. He said what needed to be said and stopped. Patton looked at the map while Kovacs spoke. He did not look at Kovacs. He looked at where the finger was pointing, then at the surrounding terrain features, then at the overlay notation at the bottom corner indicating the cartographic source date. The room was completely silent. Then he said, without raising his voice or addressing anyone in particular, "He's right. And this is where it gets complicated. Because what Patton did in the 30 seconds after that moment tells you something about how the Third Army actually worked that the battle histories tend to pass over. He did not make a scene of it. He did not deliver a lecture to his staff about verifying source dates on overlays, directed over Kovacs's head at the men who had seen the same thing and stayed quiet. He did not route the correction through someone of appropriate rank. He accepted the information, confirmed it, had the overlay corrected, and moved the briefing forward. It took less than 5 minutes. The route was adjusted. The meeting continued. The next morning, Daniel Kovacs was informed he was a sergeant. No formation, no ceremony. The paperwork had been signed the previous evening, and his sergeant first class, a man named Roy Engel, who had been standing at the side of the briefing room and who had been very quiet for the rest of the day, delivered the news with the specific expression that comes from an NCO who isn't yet sure whether he should be proud or unsettled, or whether there was any difference between the two. See, what most folks don't realize is that what Patton was promoting was not the map knowledge. Map knowledge is a qualification, not a distinction. What he was putting a stripe on was something more specific and harder to find. The willingness to be right out loud in a room full of people who outranked you at the exact moment when the cost of speaking was incalculable and the cost of staying quiet was absorbed by someone else entirely. An army built on deference is an army with a reliability problem. When the only information that reaches a commanding general has been filtered through the question of what the commanding general wants to hear, the commanding general is operating on a map of his own preferences rather than a map of actual terrain. The Third Army moved at the speed it moved, across France, through the Ardennes crisis, into Germany, in part because Patton had built, deliberately or by instinct, a command environment in which accurate information was valued over comfortable information. He was not a patient man, and he was not a gentleman, and there are plenty of accounts of him doing the opposite of what he did that morning. But the instinct that produced the promotion was the same instinct that produced the operational record. He needed the maps to be right. He needed the men around him to tell him when they weren't. And when a corporal demonstrated exactly that in front of an audience of 30 people who had chosen not to, Patton recognized what he was looking at and acted on it before the morning was over. Daniel Kovacs, 22 years old, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. His father had come over from Hungary before the First War and spent 20 years learning the weight of American steel in a mill in the Hazelwood neighborhood, a large, quiet man who understood that knowledge carried in the head could not be taken from you the way a job could, and who had put his oldest son through 2 years of drafting and survey coursework at a trade school on 2nd Avenue for exactly that reason. Kovacs had been doing field survey work for a civil engineering firm for 8 months when his draft notice arrived. 8 months of checking maps against terrain, of learning the discipline of knowing that what a map says and what the ground says are two different statements, and only one of them is true. He had a younger brother named Thomas still finishing school, and a girl named Helen who worked at a department store downtown and wrote him letters about things that were not the war, which was exactly right. He had bought a ring from a soldier who needed the cash, kept it in a small tin in his kit, and was planning on asking Helen a specific question when he got back. He had a practical plan for the afterward: finish the certification, find work with Allegheny County's engineering department. He was not a romantic. He was the kind of man who looked at a map and saw what was actually there. When Engel told him about the stripe, Kovacs' first question was whether the route had been corrected on the operational overlay. Engel looked at him for a moment, said it had. Kovacs nodded and went back to the maps. The briefing room had been reset by then. New overlays. The Third Army moved the way it always moved, fast, forward, without looking back at the rooms it had left behind. Whether the correction Kovacs had introduced into the planning saved time or fuel or something that cannot be measured because you cannot count the cost of things that don't happen, that arithmetic is impossible to perform. What is possible to say is this: a column that was going to drive toward a junction that wasn't where the map said it was, drove instead toward the junction that was. And the man who made that happen went back to his maps the next morning with one more stripe on his sleeve and the same pair of eyes he had always had. Was Patton right to promote Kovacs, to put a sergeant stripe on a corporal who had corrected a general's map reading in front of his entire staff? Some would say no, that rewarding a man for speaking out of rank in a command briefing erodes the discipline a combat army depends on, that it signals every corporal in the theater that rank is negotiable when you think you know more, and that an army cannot run on that signal. Others would say exactly the opposite, that an army which promotes deference and punishes accuracy will one day follow a confident general down a road that doesn't go where the map says it does, and that what Patton did that morning, putting a stripe on the man who told him what he needed to hear, was the most operationally important decision he made all week. Let us know in the comments below. And if you want more untold stories from World War II, make sure you subscribe.